Today we continue with our podcast of the Prophetic Writing Series. We're dealing with the book, The Messiah, and we're dealing with the fiery hell passages. Now, we mentioned previously that Messiah didn't support these fiery hell passages, and what we found was the differences between the text, showing that additions were made. We see in Mark chapter 9 and Matthew 18, they deal with this a text regarding causing these little ones to stumble and intimating that they'll be cast into the fires of hell. And it's also mentioned in Luke 1 and 2. Luke 17, 1 and 2. We see in Mark, I'll read the passage to you from verse 40. For he who is not against us is for us. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because of your name as followers of Christ, truly I say to you, he will not lose his reward. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for him if with a heavy millstone hung around his neck, he had been cast into the sea. And there's an addition now to this, which is also in Matthew, but not found in Luke. I'll read that to you in verse 43 of Mark 9. If your hand causes you to stumble, pardon me, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than having your two hands to go into hell, into the unquenchable fire. Then verse 44 was an addition that usually shows that in the various gospel accounts. Where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life lame than having 2 feet to be cast into hell. Now, similarly, in Matthew, it states, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. And then in verse 8, similarly to Mark, it says, if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It's better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and to be cast into eternal fire. And then goes on to mention the fires of hell. Now, we've shown that that Luke was written after AD 70, and that Luke had a copy of Mark before him, and he also had an updated version of the Sayings of Jeshua. Now, Luke, all that he says there in Luke 17, it states, he said to his disciples, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he was thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble. And that's all Luke writes about this. So we see from this that Luke sees all these various additions. Now, it seems like the early church at Jerusalem used this text to add these fiery hell passages. But Luke, in writing his version, this wasn't in his updated Sayings of Jeshua, and he excludes those fiery hell passages, showing that Matthew and Mark had the additions. So that shows us clearly that they didn't appear in the original versions of the Sayings of Jeshua. And we see that there are differences in Mark's version and Matthew's version. And Luke reverts to the original. You would have seen Mark's version. So either Mark was updated after AD 70, or Luke saw the update but ignored it because he didn't feel that was contained in the original. And in the Mark passage, it speaks of the worm not dying and the fire will not be quenched. And we see that's taken from Isaiah 66, which was one of the later prophetic chapters in the book of Isaiah, belonging to the school of the prophets. And they've got, it states as follows, Isaiah 66, verse 24. Then they will go forth and look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me. For the worm will not die and the fire will not be quenched, and they will be an abhorrence to all mankind. So we see that was written by the school of the prophets, and the the passage in Mark utilized that. So you can see that was a later addition, and it did not appear in the original. So those fire of hell passages have got issues related to them. And we showed that these passages in Enoch, they were written back into certain gospel accounts. For instance, Matthew 25, verse 41, it says, and he will also say to those on his left, depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. And we showed previously that this was taken from Enoch 10, from verse 11, and it speaks of the fallen angels that are bound and placed into the crevice in the earth. And Enoch 10 from 11 states as follows, and the Lord said unto Michael, go and bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them and in all their uncleanness. And when these sons have slain one another, and they've seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the days of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. In those days they shall be led off to the abyss of fire, and to the torment and the prison, in which they shall be confined forever. So we see that's the passage that this Matthew is actually relating to in Matthew 25:41. So that was taken from the book of Enoch. And we also see things like the parable of the sowing of the seed and the tares planted amongst the wheat. And we see also there's an addition in Mark 4:29, which is not found in Matthew or Luke. Mark 4:29 states, but when the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. Now they're relating this to the apocalyptic passages that speak of these events taking place at the end of the age, but that's not found in the other gospel accounts. And there's also the parable in Matthew 13, the parable of the tares amongst the wheat. And this only appears in Matthew 13, and it says that the wheat was sowed, and then these tares came up in between them. And from verse 30 it says, allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. And he said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So we see apocalyptic overtones in this, and it carries on in verse 40. It says, so just are the tares are gathered up and burned, so just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now this parable doesn't appear in Mark or Luke, so we see it was definitely an addition that was placed there, and it was placed to show their apocalyptic belief. Now we showed earlier how these gospels developed, and that the sayings of Yeshua were updated up into the 70s, after 70 AD. And we see that eventually the teaching of the church and the teaching of the disciples and the apostles, which wasn't spoken by Messiah, was eventually confused with words from Messiah, and those were placed into that document and ended up in these gospel accounts. And that's where that one would have actually would have appeared. We showed that Enoch, that speaks of all these fiery hell passages, actually took them from the Zoroastrian concept of the judgment of the unrighteous in this molten metal river that flowed. And Enoch often speaks of this. Enoch 54 verse 6, and Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Phanuel took hold of them on the great day and cast them that day into the burning furnace, that the Lord of spirits might take vengeance on them for their unrighteousness in becoming subject to Satan and leading astray those who dwell on the earth. So we see all of these fiery passages in Enoch 108. Also they speak of that scene where the situation in Sheol was based on. Enoch 108 from verse 3 states, "And wait ye indeed till sinners passed away, for their names shall be blotted out of the book of life, and out of the holy books, and their seed shall be destroyed forever, and their spirit shall be slain. And they shall cry and make lamentation in a place that is a chaotic wilderness, and in the fire they shall burn, for there is no earth there. And I saw there something like an invisible cloud, for by reason of its depth I could not look over." So there was a depth and he could not look over, speaking of this gulf. "And I saw a flame of fire blazing brightly, and things like shining mountains circling and sweeping to and fro. And I asked one of the holy angels who was with me, and he said to me, what is this shining thing? For it is not a heaven, but only the flame of a blazing fire, and the voice of weeping and crying and lamentation and strong pain. And he said unto me, this place which you have seen, here are cast the spirits of sinners and blasphemers, and those who work wickedness, and of those who pervert everything that the Lord has spoken through the mouth of the prophets." So here is a description of that scene. And we know that Luke writes something similar, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which was a teaching that developed in the church on this particular portion of text here in Enoch 108. So we see these concepts were taken largely from the Book of Enoch. And we've mentioned that the Book of Enoch actually mentions this river, this molten metal river. And it's in Enoch 67 from verse 5. It says, "And I saw that valley in which there was a great convulsion, and a convulsion of the waters. And when all this took place, from that fiery molten metal, and from the convulsion thereof in that place, there was produced a smell of sulfur. And it was connected with those waters, and the valley of the angels who had led astray mankind burned beneath that land. And through its valleys proceeds streams of fire, where these angels are punished, who had led astray those who dwell on the earth." So they mention this molten metal and the smell of sulfur. And we've shown that elements of that are also found in the book of Revelation. So we see generally this hellfire situation was something that the church wanted to show. But we see that original mark doesn't contain these hellfire texts, and we've shown that John also is lacking in many of these hellfire presentations. And the fact that the hellfire texts are mostly in Matthew and that developed at Jerusalem. And we show that they were an apocalyptic assembly and got much of their ideas and their views from the book of Enoch and the book of the Assumption of Moses, and that they weren't in the original sayings of Jeshua. And we see that even in this passage in Mark, with those that cause the little ones to stumble, that there were additions made to that, and that Luke reverts to the original in the sayings of Jeshua. So these are the texts found in the gospel accounts, and we show that there are issues with them, and we show that Messiah didn't support these apocalyptic ideas. So on that note, we finish this particular podcast. Remember, these books are available at Amazon.com and bookbaby.com. You do a search under Ernest Orson Adams. Thank you for watching.